Hello, everyone. I'm Jordan Carter, curator and co-head of the curatorial department here at DIA, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to today's program, a conversation with Renée Green and Mason Leaver-Yap, moderated by me, engaging the film that we all just collectively perceived, America's Veritas, as well as really thinking about Renée's approach to moving image more broadly. I should note this was also the New York premiere of America's Veritas, a film from 2018, site responsively adapted here into a 4-channel installation. And before I sort of leap into introducing my interlocutors today, I also want to call out that this was in dialogue with and sort of a counterpoint to Renée's major and expansive exhibition at Dia Beacon on view through next year through August of 2026, The Equator Has Moved, which constellates historical, reimagined, and newly commissioned works. Additionally, there will be a publication for this exhibition that will launch early next year, 2026, so look forward to that. Since the late 1980s, Renée Green, her multidisciplinary practice has really probed ideas of perception and memory by drawing on traditions of minimal and conceptual art, as well as a range of references and sources, be they literary, historical, or philosophical. Renée has exhibited really extensively throughout the United States and internationally, including a major recent survey at KW Institute of Art in Berlin and DAAD Gallery that traveled subsequently to the Migros Museum of Contemporary Art in Zurich called Inevitable Distances, and that was organized by none other than Mason Leaver-Yap. And so Mason here is a curator and scholar based in Glasgow who collaborates with artists like Renée to produce publications, exhibitions, and other projects. And Renée is one of myriad artists that Mason collaborates with over extended periods of time. So I'm thrilled to be in conversation with them today. But before we begin, I also want to thank my amazing colleagues who were essential in the production of the film installation and today's program, including Ella Denelzen, Kim Golding, and Max Tanone. Maybe to get things started, when we all walked in and got our seats today, the typographic treatment for the film America's Veritas was on the 4 channels here. And I think it's very prominent, the presence of this colon that both sort of links these two ideas, notions, entities, aspirations of America's and Veritas, but also in its sort of central spacing between these two words creates perhaps a connection, a sense of secession, but also a dialectical opposition, perhaps. So I wanted to maybe start there in thinking through this treatment, this title, and how it sort of frames your project that unfolded in 2018, Renée, at the Carpenter Center. It was sort of the culmination, for context, of a 2-year residency at the Carpenter Center at Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Okay, thank you, Jordan. I actually like to thank everybody for being here and thank Mason for coming over to participate in this. And so yes, I think to think about the title, America's Veritas. America's, first of all, I think it's important to think about what would be implied by Americas, plural. And so I wanted to indicate that there isn't any one America, that there are multiple ones. And also to think about this in terms of North, South, Central America. For instance. And in terms of Veritas, for those who are familiar with the Carpenter Center and also Harvard University, the logo contains the word Veritas, meaning truth. And so combining them and using the colon to space them so that there could be a kind of play between could raise all kinds of questions about what could be the relationship between the two. So those are some of the things I was thinking about in terms of starting it. And then from there, it was actually a way to make a work that was for presenting at Harvard, and also could address what I was really interested in part, which was the building of the Carpenter Center, and Le Corbusier, who was the architect, and the fact that despite many utopian dreams Le Corbusier had about being able to build any buildings in the Americas, he was able to have only two constructed. One was the Carpenter Center, and the other one was in Argentina, in La Plata, the Casa Courichet. And so I was really interested in probing both of those buildings and exploring what could be the histories of both in terms of the entire process of bringing those to fruition and who was involved in actually doing the labor to make it happen. So those were some of the things I was, that sort of like were initial ideas in terms of this Carpenter Center related project and inhabitation.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to kind of think about it. Initially, like when I was thinking about starting places, I was like, oh, titles. But then, Jordan, you said typographical treatment. And it's interesting because I saw this work at the Carpenter, but it wasn't really until you did I think that you produced artist pages for Art Forum when David Velasco was still an editor there, and the 2020 issue. And I really kind of understood it as a typographical treatment. And now, again, today, when we were just like sitting in the dark, this kind of anticipatory feeling, I was like, oh, but it's also kind of like the colon is temporal, right? You have the countdown clock, and then you have the words. There's like this kind of really interesting equivalences that we see, and these kind of ways in which that colon does like a lot of heavy lifting in terms of producing doubles, I think. It's never an equal sign, you know? And it kind of comes across, I think you've used it quite a lot in your work. I think one of the pieces that's actually, you see part of it appear in Americas Veritas is another work called Code Survey, which also like occupies this colon. So I was just trying to think a little bit about like how that title functions for you in terms of it's like a bit of a primer or something. Can you say a little bit about that like actually the typography of it, and then how it is immediately followed up by this crawler text that is another sort of primer in itself, like a kind of narrative textual prelude to the action, quote unquote action that we kind of see. It's very cinematic. I mean, Jordan, like you said, it was like quite Star Wars.
It's a bit Star Wars, yeah.
It's a bit Star
sort
Wars.
Of vertical script.
Yeah,
sort
and
of
I'm
adding a bit of a quasi-futuristic element to it, but speculative aspect perhaps.
But I'm kind of curious if you could talk a little bit more about that I guess these are all decisions, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so there is no voice, for example, in this film. So there's no voiceover. But in terms of using the forms that could also be recognizable, meaning the scrolling, the scrolling and the rolling text, those were meant to create a kind of a mood, and also for those who would be familiar with Star Wars, a kind of framework. And so, I mean, in terms of just like using something specific that relates to movement, to form, also to typography. Typography for Americas Veritas, it's like a Latin, like a kind of Roman typeface. It's similar to the one that is used on the Harvard logo. and making it run sideways was one of the things I was interested in, so that the attention to that space in between with the colon could be more noticeable. Also, I was trying to think of ways in which, there was a lot of nervousness when I had proposed the project. In terms of how would Harvard be represented. They're very concerned about whether there would be some kind of documentation that could be marketed as like a product or something like that. And so there were a lot of discussions before about what would be entailed, and so that sort of affected certain decisions that I made for making this work. Yeah.
You mentioned this idea of inhabitation, and all of your work really, there is a deep consideration of site and architecture, and over time, including the exhibition at Dia Beacon, and of course the exhibition at the Carpenter Center, where you spent 2 years in residence, culminating in this film. And this idea of inhabitation, I think, is interesting to dwell on a bit, because this is not the first time you've inhabited, say, the ghost of Le Corbusier. Over 30 years ago in 1993, you actually lived for a week, sort of set up camp, or sort of, existed, inhabited within a vacant concrete housing block, Unité d'Habitation in Firminy in France, as part of Project Unité, and developed a project of both moving images and photographs, sort of documenting your relation to this space as part of a work called Secret. So I was curious to think a little bit about the relationship between inhabiting space and the production of moving image, but also, your approach to site and architecture as an inhabitant, and sort of that process and connecting both of these two engagements with Le Corbusier over this 3-decade gap, if you will.
Okay, thanks for that. With the idea of inhabitation, I can say that in all instances, these were invitations. And I can expand this also to thinking about the Schindler House, which was another project in Los Angeles in 2015. But thinking about it, really, inhabitations and invitations, I think thinking about them together can be sort of interesting, because it isn't as if it's about owning the house or owning the place in any kind of real estate fashion, but it's about choosing what way to engage or occupy the space. And so in my case, I like to take it over in some sense, whether it's like sonically or, in all kinds of different ways. It's interesting to, I would say, test the space, and wondering about what is it like to live in the space. When it's a house, for example, like Schindler House, I was really curious about that. And also physically testing the space, meaning like stretching my body in different places, or lying down in rooms that were meant to be the bedroom or whatever the rooms were, or similarly in the Casa Courchette, because it's a house, strange house. Also, it was a medical office. In addition, a doctor lived there, or was a person who had it built originally. But in different instances, in terms of most spaces, I'm really curious about what does it feel like, and how is it to be there, and what takes place in it, and how might that alter in relation to what it is that it its use or function might be. And so Carpenter Center also is a place that was within walking distance to where I live in Massachusetts from Somerville. And so I was really interested in accepting the invitation because it was something, it involved a place that I could visit over and over again. I could just walk there like 15, 20 minutes. And in most instances with invitations for exhibitions and projects, it's not really possible to spend that much time. Not usually like with DIA, for example, that something could go on for more than a year or whatever. And so with the Carpenter Center invitation, as it was originally proposed 2 years, I thought it could be interesting to do something that wasn't so fleeting and like product oriented. So that was part of what the inhabitation. It becomes, I don't know. I sort of like think about it's very visceral, experiencing spaces. Similarly with Le Corbusier Habitation Unité in Firminy, it was really like I went there. I was there more than once and spent time there, and also just wandered around and and then eventually I was sleeping there. I was the only one who was doing that, and it was kind of scary. But I think I'm really interested in spaces, all kinds of different spaces. Yeah.
I was really interested in this thing you just said. You said that you're interested in testing the space, which is like, it's kind of the way that you describe how the architecture kind of produces maybe like a certain rhythm of life or a certain way of being. Like to then kind of say like, oh, I'm going to test the space is almost to kind of maybe not go up against it, but really bring a certain kind of power, a different kind of power to a space, or the power that is exerted upon you there?
Yeah, I mean, it's also trying to imagine the space at the same time, because sometimes spaces are like, there might be something about them that is compelling, or it might be, or they seem really broken down or something. It might be something that seems like, well, is there a possibility of doing something in this space? What could this be like? But I mean, I think for myself, it goes back to like very early in childhood, kind of like just being curious about other places where people lived and wondering about what those places were like, and wanting to go inside of them and staring through the windows, looking at them, walking around the spaces and really just being really interested in what could they be like. And I mean, this continues, still curious about like how are the people living in whatever kind of place it is, or how do they inhabit that space. And so, for example, like with most institutions, like say universities, like Harvard University, or MIT, another institute, the kinds of spaces, I think they very much affect like how people feel during the course of a day. And so I'm curious about that as well. So there's so many different ways a space can be, how you can exist with it, and also how you might adapt it or change it or whatever. And so those are things that, understanding that could be a possibility, rather than that the space itself is solely making you without a possibility. That's kind of what I'm sort of curious about that. But I'm also, I mean, in terms of the architects, like Le Corbusier or with Schindler, their kind of utopian ideas of what they imagined is also really interesting, has been interesting to me. So what could they possibly, what were they thinking, in terms of certain kinds of decisions they made, or certain kinds of materials, or all kinds of different things that they chose.
I'm kind of curious about, you kind of talk about this like it being a childhood preoccupation, and the way that you describe it sounds like a kind of transition from going from from far away towards something, or it could be like from inside to outside. And you talk about institutions, like what it might mean to like inhabit an institution. I was like curious about how that might relate to the function of what we see here, because the way in which we look at these spaces is it's not how we know these spaces necessarily. This 360-degree camera, which was quite new at the time that you made this film, right? Or like relatively new technology. It wasn't something that I'd really seen this type of vision before. But kind of what was the decision around that this was the camera, or this was the way to see or reform or reconstitute an image of like these two very dispersed places?
Well, I guess, I mean, in terms of thinking about this kind of visceral relationship to a place or whatever, and how could you represent like entering a place or becoming one with the place? The camera, the way that I was using it in part had to do with like a really granular exploration of all of the surfaces, of all the different spaces. And there were a combination of different kinds of ways that are taking place with the circling around the space. And so it was physical circling. There was also the use of drones inside and outside in the Carpenter Center space, not in the La Plata space. And then there's the post-production work with the filters and things that are adapting, like how it could be stretched and turned and things like that. And so, yeah, this was in 2018. And yeah, I mean, I worked with someone who was licensed to operate the drone inside and outside. That was a Harvard stipulation to be able to have it go inside and circle some of the elements. Some of those elements are similar to ones that are at Dia Beacon, these beacho structures. And so, yeah, it's in terms of what was done at that time, yeah, I guess it was relatively the recent use. Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of your work deals with, you know, these ideas of contact, but also distance, which I think are really pronounced with this drone technology and it also relates to ideas of inhabitation versus disembodiment as we think about these architectures, because thinking about this work in relationship to, say, Secret, in which you're documenting literal traces of you being in this place. Here, although we are entering these spaces, there's a sense of you operating at a remove, and the body is very much so not present. So I'm just curious, maybe for you to reflect on that a bit.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting combination, because part of what I was doing in Secret, and those are black and white photographs, but also video. And in the video, I use a tripod. I'm videotaping myself in all of these different situations inside, and on the terrace, and sometimes outside of the building, of the Unité. In this case, it's again me moving with the camera through all of the spaces. I'm not shooting myself at all. I'm focusing on the building, surfaces, and also moving all the time as I kept moving through like the ramps and in and out of the space. So that was using my body, but I'm not representing my body. And the drone cameras, they were operated by someone else. I was next to them, but that person was licensed to operate them. And so that was something that's at a remove. Also, that's something that could, those were, it was possible to go up very high. And that was one of the things I was really interested in. I mean, it's sort of like the backdrop here is kind of from that sort of possibility of being able to go make an aerial shot. And so yeah, the combination of distance and proximity, I would say, are used to be able to create these different effects. Mm-hmm.
It's really kind of, I mean, obviously it seems almost so obvious to say that it's quite psychedelic experience. And then you have these kind of, these two circles that keep on like, almost staring back at you. Like this very anthropomorphic experience. So you're trying to look, or you're trying to observe something whilst also the feeling of being watched at the same time. And I'm interested in, maybe this is like another kind of quality of this doubling, like it's such an artificial experience, but then you start thinking about like, well, wait, what is a natural experience? Or you talked about Le Corbusier's ideas around like architecture, and Jordan, you'd mentioned the body and embodiment in relation to this, and it's very tied in with his ideas about what would be natural, or like what would be neutral. And of course, you know, these are entirely artificial constructions. And I'm kind of curious to maybe talk a little bit, or hear you talk about the differences of a work like this in contrast to some of the work that we're seeing up at Beacon, in the sense that this is a kind of highly edited, highly constructed video where the technology is kind of shaping us, and it's looking back at us as we look at it, and we're looking at it in a kind of essentially like a black box. And then at Dia Beacon, it's, you know, you're flooded with natural light, and a lot of the works in the color series are kind of probing this word natural or neutral and nature. I'm kind of curious to kind of see or hear a little bit about your movement between these kinds of things. Like the movement between this high artifice and then this other thing that's happening that's like maybe slower than that. They occupy very different times for me.
Okay, that's interesting. It's interesting to hear you describe them that way. And I think this idea of nature, for example, or what might be natural or what might be neutral, those are things that I've been sort of raising questions about for a while. And so in some of those works, at Dia Beacon, the earlier works, there's some different kinds of references to it, ways of thinking about it and questions about it, like also going back to the 19th century sort of forms of classification that were in contrast to some ways that I was interested in, or I was interested in the ways that these kinds of classifications were being made, for example. But I think that sort of carries through into the Le Corbusier times as well, in terms of modernism and certain ways of imagining relationships to nature and what would be culture and what would be constructed, and how would something natural, what would that mean? How would that exist? What would be a body? What's the border or the boundary between that and the building? These kinds of things kind of run through some of those writings. And so in this case, I was mentioning to Mason earlier that the year when this work was made, or around the time that this was made, was also a time of like a kind of Bauhaus celebration time. And it was like kind of all, you know, many places it was like being advertised, or I was finding it in different places, and I was curious about, well, like, what about melting it? Or what about twisting it? Or how about, you know, changing, you know, that it's not like a rectangle or right degree angle, or I don't know, just like different kinds of things that have to do, that are part of the whole, the ideology related to modernity and building. And what about other ways of perceiving? And also, how might one feel in the places and have these other kinds of experiences, almost like, well, psychedelic, you mentioned psychedelic, but, or surreal, or I was thinking about those things. And so in terms of photographic approaches, I was also thinking about somebody like Berenice Abbott, for example, and different sorts of experiments she was doing. She was doing them at MIT, some of those ones, with physics, and also like changing shapes of things, distortions of different kinds. So yeah, some of these ideas I was thinking about in relation. Mm-hmm.
This idea of sort of liquefying these rigid or modernist geometries sort of brings me back to the media bichos, which feature in the film, and the new variants of bichos that house a number of moving image works up at Dia Beacon, and this idea of creating flexible geometries for inhabiting and viewing and listening to these works, and sort of creating these geometries in a way that can structure viewership, our conditions of viewership. And so I wanted to maybe hear you talk a little bit around your intention for those geometries and the ways in which you would like to inform different possibilities of viewing or listening to these media works.
Yes. So, I mean, in terms of thinking about modernism, I wanted to also think about like different ways in which it's been enacted in different parts of the world. Whenever these kinds of utopian ideas about it had emerged, or when people were engaging with them. So also in Latin America, in different locations, there are also different ways that people were working with these ideas. And so in Brazil, for example, that was one I was thinking about. Also when making those bichos, the media bichos, and this is, I mean, people who are familiar with the word bicho, bug, insect, small child, in Portuguese or in Spanish, and also understand that there's been a relationship to the work that Ligia Clark had done. And so these, and also Elio Oiticica, in relation to this kind of, parangoles, movable sorts of works with textiles and structures, but also wearable. And so I was thinking about this time period as well, like in the 1950s, and then certain crossovers that would take place, like from Europe, like from like the school, in terms of kinds of transfers of ideas and ways that they would be enacted in different kinds of locations, different climates. And so those were also some of my thoughts when approaching, thinking about, well, this Le Corbusier version of something made, either in the United States or in Latin America, as well as other kinds of attempts in different parts of the world during that time, trying to kind of, I don't know, create this like a utopian version of life, which what we can see now, it's pretty different.
I mean, it's interesting to think about you were talking about, I guess, the movement of ideas, or I think a lot about like the export of culture. And when we think about modernism, the kind of the Bauhaus story being like the European modernism is exported out. And I was thinking about the soundtrack to the film, and actually like how we can kind of think about the inverse of these things, or like what we kind of consider modernist gestures now. So on the one hand, you have, like, we think about like the Bauhaus branding exercise on that birthday that it had, that we were subjected to for a whole year. And then, you know, on the flip side of that, the export of other cultures. So I was thinking, as I was kind of watching America's Veritas, I was also listening to America Veritas, and that techno soundtrack, I was thinking a lot about how this was like a German record, but obviously it has its roots in Detroit. So that movement of that music genre, its development within back to Europe, or back to Europe. I don't want to use that word, no, but that genre as well, like in terms of dub techno, it's a genre that I associate really with kind of a lot of echo, of repetition, but also of decay.
Okay, yeah.
And I was curious if you could talk a little bit about this, because I'm conscious that on one level you've got precursors to the ways in which you've looked at that movement of culture in terms of the work that you made, Import Export Funk Office. That was a kind of similar thing.
Right.
We have it in such specificity in America's Veritas.
Right, yeah, no, well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because there was also like an in-between work called Wavelengths from 2002. It was a series focusing on electronic music, and it was made between 1999 and 2002. I made it during those years, and in different locations, different scenes that were focusing on, techno and electronic music. So in Barcelona, Vienna, Los Angeles, and New York. But in terms of thinking about the histories and trajectories, the decay aspect is something that also came up in terms of thinking about like Detroit techno, for example, and making some kind of links between industrialization and ways in which people were kind of repurposing spaces, and also the ways that sounds were being used in different kinds of ways. I mean, it's just like a very simplistic summary, but I think that those are, in terms of like a kind of visceral feeling about it, like in terms of, say, like a concrete structure, like this room itself, I thought lent itself to this sort of combination. And when I came in to the room, I thought, oh, it's perfect for being able to do this with the floor and these columns and just its basic square structure. And then, I mean, what was very exciting, we didn't talk about this, why 4 projections. And I mean, well, there were 4 projectors, so it seemed like a good idea. And the sound system. And so it was possible to circulate, to make something kind of immersive. And I wanted to make something that gave a kind of more club-like atmosphere that was something that I would associate with previous experiences. In terms of like the wavelengths moments, or like from the 90s into the early 2000s. And so kind of a techno rave thing. And then with the Puerto Rick's soundtrack, that was just kind of in sync with that. And then, I mean, I was working with Javier Angera and making experiments with the sound and combining the moving images. And the way that they kind of synced was very interesting. He was just like playing around with that, and then while watching it, it was seeming as if it was really cohering and creating a different kind of way that you could perceive of what was going on. And so I think I think of these things as very interconnected, like the kind of bodily experience of the space as well as the sound, and then also other kinds of feelings that are kind of buried that emerge. So yeah.
Maybe you can elaborate on that a bit more, this idea of the relationship between sound and space in your work. And for instance, I think in this installation, you could also hear sort of the bass and some of the sound, even in the lobby, almost functioning as a mode of alluring viewers, listeners, perceivers into this space where there would be this sort of heavy bass reveal. But also up at Dia Beacon, you've created a scenario or a scenography in which there's this kind of constant hum almost of some sense of a sonic presence, very spectral, that becomes increasingly intelligible as you approach the sonic bichos, or the bicho units for the moving images that include sound. Also in one of the corridors, there's a piece in which you're whispering the names of imaginary places in ways that become at moments discernible and at other moments sort of fainter and more abstract. So I've always been sort of curious about the ways in which your work uses sound, not only as like content, but as a way of setting a mood or a way of choreographing or modulating the movements of bodies, and also as a contextual device in terms of creating a certain ambiance in works like Pigskin Library, with that sort of militaristic soundtrack.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, in terms of just kind of thinking about it, I could say, like, for overall way, maybe, it's almost like, okay, like with a film, for example, the combination of what would be the sound and what would be the image, that's something that, it's sutured, to use that word, sometimes, and so you don't necessarily notice it. It sort of lulls you into whatever it is. And there are layers of sound also that are used often. I think in different works, like some of the earlier works that I made, also sound has been important to me throughout my whole life. I'm coming from sound, educated in sound in a way, and the separation of the sound and an object, or creating an ambience of some kind with sound, I think is a really interesting situation. And it's almost as if it's like taking it, it's sort of like separating it from like what would be like a cinematic kind of approach in a way, to like an ambience that maybe creeps up on you, or you find something through the sound when it's like a structure or another kind of a space or something like that, where you hear the sound. Like, for example, in Neutral Natural, that's one of the works at Dia Beacon. There was a moment where people who were working there, they thought that a bird was loose, or there were these animal sounds and bird sounds and different things in the space. You don't know exactly where they're coming from, and then it's sort of like finding where they are. And so I like that kind of situation where the sound is something that you don't know necessarily right away where it's coming from. And so that's also kind of like a sort of, it's like a kind of embedded way of coming into contact with an aspect of yourself, maybe, or of some strange thing that happens with sound. I like to use the sound also as a way to definitely to create a mood. So with certain voices also, like I use the sound of my brother, who's a death metal performer, his voice, because I really liked the timbre. I wanted it to be something like really, like strong, and give this feeling that it was made it hard for you to really understand. I mean, it's sort of like instant recognition on a certain level of like, oh, this is like something that's seemingly ominous, but at the same time, the words are different that are uttered. And so I like this kind of different tensions between things that create another thing. So I can say that's like what I think in general for this sort of way.
In terms of these sort of spectral resonances, to shift from the sonic maybe to some of your citations or sort of historical interlocutors, I wanted to raise a collaboration that you two had done previously, actually during a time that we were both at the Walker Arts Center on another commission called EDHF, in which you're sort of positioning yourself in relation to Harun Farokhi, or maybe Farokhi is more of a device for more expanded meditation, if you will. But I'm curious to hear about the ways in which you engage this various network of historical figures throughout your works, both at Dia Beacon and in terms of these architects, Le Corbusier, Schindler, but filmmakers like Harun Farokhi, Chantal Akerman, Hollis Frampton, and the list goes on. But of course, in ways that are always oblique and abstract and personal. But I also wanted to hear you both reflect on the commission process, because one aspect of the Walker Commission that I found interesting and reflective of Renée's approach more broadly is this sense of simultaneity, or migration across formats, as embedded within the invitation itself, in the sense that the Walker Commission debuted online, but also had a cinematic premiere. And in many ways, as we can see in this room, your work is very adaptable to the conditions of the space and the ways in which you distribute your work quite purposefully across different sites and formats and settings that might elicit different ways of perceiving them.
I mean, I guess it always depends on which, the specific work it is and what takes place. I mean, I was invited, you invite me, right? To do, I mean, there was, with the Walker, Harun Farokhi's work was collected. It was in the collection, and the invitation was to engage with the collection in some way. And so in terms of trying to find someone that I felt like I had a personal connection with, Harun Farokhi was the person, because I did know him. And also, I mean, so the work was made in 2017. He passed away in 2014. And it was sort of like a chance to reflect on a number of things. But it was interesting because it also kind of crossed with something that I was developing when I did an artist on artist talk, focusing on Kawara. But I also wanted to include Chantal Akerman because I wanted to bring her up into the collection of here also, the Dia. So, I mean, in terms of like the different voices and things, I think of them sometimes, I mentioned to you before, as a kind of characters in a way, but also as a kind of like models of creative beings of some kind that I'm really fascinated by. I'm fascinated by their work and what it opens in different ways. And so it's like being able to converse with them in a way, even though they're not around. And so that's something that I frequently do. So, I don't know. Do you want to say anything about this process?
I mean, maybe I can add a couple of brief things. I mean, I'm conscious that you want... there was a suggestion to have audience questions, so I'll try and be brief while people come up with their amazing questions. But yeah, just to reflect a little bit on that process of how Renée came to make this work. I think it was actually quite casual that I had been doing some research in the collection. I was like, we got all these Harun Farokhi works, they're just so good. And you said, I knew him. And I was like, what? And you were like, yeah, he took my job at Vienna when I left, and he took my professorship. And I was like, That's really interesting. And so I was thinking a little bit about, I guess, the ways in which artists, particularly like people who were incredibly active in the 80s and 90s, were moving around and had certain kind of networks, and that there was, obviously this predates the internet and network culture as we know it now, but the exchange of ideas was felt very true to the ways in which you had talked to me about Faroki, and also what Faroki was doing in terms of his own work. I think that you and I both talked about Schnittstelle, this work that he made in the 90s, where he was looking at the editing desk, and how the editing desk is this kind of almost this magical, strange space that's in like dark rooms, in pokey little basements, in like attic, like they're just kind of shoved away a little bit, but actually what they do in terms of a kind of imaginative space and transformation, and also transforming the world in a way from that small desk, is really interesting to think about as you talk about the process of editing yourself. And so the work EDHF was really, I guess, reflecting on what it might mean to have a kind of a life in traces, but also edited, or you used the word sutured earlier, like how we kind of put these fragments together and how we make sense of them. But the thing that was really interesting about working with you, Renée, on that piece was the way in which you kind of combined your biographies, or that there was this very slippery eye that kind of moved in and out, and sometimes it was Haroon, sometimes it was you, and maybe it was something in between, and that almost that fictive space became incredibly generative for me to think about your work as a whole, because, you know, as we've talked about with these other figures, like whether it's Le Corbusier or Schindler, or, you know, we talked about Chantal Akerman and Onkawara, they all in some ways become I guess figures is not quite the right word.
Repositories?
Yeah,
Surrogates.
repositories. Yeah, but they're yeah, you said characters earlier.
Said characters.
And that actually that there's a porosity of fiction and a non-fiction, or history and myth. You know, Audre Lorde talks about automythobiography in Zami, and that's a really kind of useful generative term. And that was in some ways how I started to think about your work. You know, I was like, oh, but who is Renée Green? Like, Renée Green also as this figure that occupies different places, spaces, times, this kind of this movement through history and sci-fi as well. You know, I'm really, really struck with the ways in which we opened this conversation today when you were talking about the typographical elements. And as I was thinking, I was like, there's something about this that is really sticking with me. That Romanesque, this kind of ancient Romanesque font that is supposed to be so clear, and is almost like kind of mechanizing language for maximum dispersion, is also a tool of empire and a tool of expansion. And actually the way that Americas Veritas ends is on this very opaque, it's almost hard to read, it's graffiti, and it says wake up. And that's the kind of the closing moment. And I was like, oh, there's something about the opacity, or this other way of writing, this other way of thinking that it kind of pushed together in this work. I know I've tried to cover a lot there, and maybe I'll stop there before we want to open questions. But that working on EDHF on that commission really, I guess, opened up a set of possibilities in terms of thinking about what would a survey, or what would a constellation, or what would a group of works be by one named artist that are actually very hard to group together. It's an impossible task, and it shouldn't be. People are different versions of themselves in their lives and at different times.
So Well, that was capacious and fantastic, and a great way of transitioning into questions. And just before I do that, I do want to encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to, when you walk outside of the program space on the left, is a print we've installed as part of the installation, America's Veritas Opacities, that gives another way, another entry point into the process of the ever-fugitive Renée Green. And some of the sort of literary, photographic references, and as part of the production or the process of the production of the film. And of course, reading, writing, drawing are all integral parts of her filmmaking and expanded visual practice. So it's an invitation to be a part of that process.
I was thinking about, that's just something, when I hear architecture, I'm thinking about ghosts. And my question is, do you believe in ghosts? And yeah, because I'm thinking of them as like unfinished business, right? Like trapped in buildings or rooms, and then ghosts, I don't know, as the architects, modernism, the labor that's in there, the people that live there. And when you like go into a space and you test it, like what do you say, you're testing a space, I'm thinking of like, it's kind of like a cute way of challenging it as well. So I was wondering if you had any encounters with ghosts there, and or if you see it that way or this way. Like if you don't believe in ghosts, maybe you're just like, I don't care, you know. But yeah, I'm curious about that.
And then question 2 in the middle here.
I'm going to try to condense my question a bit, but essentially thinking about like previous works that I've seen of yours, there's always like this notion of world building, and also like this
notion of
world building.
World
building.
World building. Sorry.
Yeah. And I really like what Jordan said about liquefying geometries, because there is, to me, it's like you inhabit space like water does. And so it's like this absorption to then adapt and then open the space up to its ultimate boundary. But there's a lot of presence in this video, like watching it, like you feel very present. And so I'm wondering, how does the living present feel for you in thinking across deep time, human conceptions of time, the present moment, yesterday, and tomorrow, if there is even a tomorrow to think of? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Okay, I'll try to hold that.
Last but certainly not least, Lisa Lefebvre.
I've got a really simple question that I'd really like all three of you to respond to. What role does breath play in Renée's work? And I'm asking this question on the basis of the incredibly erudite words the three of you have used. I'm thinking about porosity, inside, outside. But does breath matter?
It's also really interesting. And so I can say for all three, and you know, I'll share that with both Jordan and Mason for responding. But let me see how I can respond. And I want to think about each one. And okay, in this very short period of time. So I can say, I mean, in terms of the idea of ghost, I was actually saying to both Jordan and Mason, I didn't really want to get into like even the term haunting, for example. Yet I think that, well, ghost, I do think that things, I mean, there's a metaphorical way of thinking about it, but also in terms of what you feel in a place. And that, you know, there's something that had been there before, and the way that that had existed that you might not know about, but you feel it in a particular kind of way. And that's something that happens in all sorts of different places and spaces. And I think that it's also connected to layers of history also, in terms of places. And and I do discuss this with people about how that takes place for them, and it can vary. And so, yes, I do think there are traces that carry through time in some way, in the land, in the different places. I think you can feel it. It is possible. And so, and then in terms of, it was a very layered question, the second one, involving time and space and things. And those are all things and world building as well. And I'm interested in all of that. And in, I mean, where to begin with that one? I think that sort of, it feeds into thinking about, well, what remains, and then what's generated from anything, and also what's imagined. And the question about, well, given all of these different aspects, like what could be, what could come. I think that, I mean, we haven't discussed that much about speculation, or fiction, the speculations that exist with that and that kind of possibility, but that also enters into the world as well. So I think that they go back and forth, and I guess, I mean, in my case, I don't feel. I don't want to say that kind of a trope about pessimistic the optimism, but I think that there's space to be able to continue to imagine and to think and to feel, but also to recognize and acknowledge in a much deeper way. That's only the surfaces have been scratched. And then in terms of breath, I would say that breath is hugely important, and it's something that I thought about a lot, actually. Well, felt it, also in terms of like what's alive, who's alive, and what the sound of the breath is like when someone's dying, and what kinds of relationship you have listening to the breath. So those were actually factors in terms of making the films. From the Begin Again one, it's not here, it wasn't here, but a film made in 2015 that was presented in the Schindler House, and works that grew out of that. And so I kind of connected to the EDHF work, which means extraterritorial / Harun Faroki. And so the acronym. So there's a kind of, I would say one of the things that we didn't touch on really in relationship to my work is that it's a kind of ongoing thing. It's ongoing and it's becoming, and it isn't as if it's like a finished, it's not finished. It's like a conversation that keeps going on. And it doesn't mean that they're not discrete parts. There are, yet something else feeds another thing and another thing and another thing, and it just keeps, and that's kind of how it's been. And so some things are organic, like what Mason was referring to with our conversation about Faroki. But I think when things are like embedded in your memory and they recur, it's impossible not to return to them. And that's also related to ghosts, I think. Things that come back, they don't go away, they just keep returning. And so how you face them or trace what they are or what that is also a part of a whole process. So, yeah, that's what I have to say.
That's really amazing. I mean, they're great questions, and there's actually just so much in common between all three. I mean, I guess as a way of kind of connecting them, maybe I'll try and kind of work backwards, which is in terms of breath. When you were talking about breath, I think about it like maybe a rather kind of scientifically in terms of like the function of distributing oxygen throughout the body. And so it's really breathing. If we think about it, we can think about it as circulation or an act of distribution. And I was very conscious of when Renée, when we were working on EDHF, you said that that film came out of a post-alive moment, and which ties so closely to like what you're talking about in terms of one's last breaths. And if I kind of think a little bit about like what it means to kind of have circulation and distribution, it's really about like how the body fits together, and the body doesn't necessarily, hopefully, isn't just singular. It's like everybody, and our capacity to work together. And then when you were saying the E is extraterritorial, I was conscious that it's extraterritorial durations. Which was the title of a George Steiner book, I think from the 70s. And I actually I wrote down a quote from Extraterritorial Durations by Steiner, and maybe this kind of goes a little bit to this question of circulation and movement, either of water, of people, of ghosts, of breath. And he says, "It seems proper that those who create art in a civilization of quasi-barbarism, which had made so many homeless, which has torn up tongues and people by the root, should themselves be poets, unhoused, and wanderers across language." And so I think about this, the movement of all of us, whether or not it's like chosen or forced, whether it's like, I guess, choice or violence, is like really important in thinking about like how are we going to work together? Like how will we allow each other to breathe, not just ourselves.
Beautiful. In the interest of time, I'll be incredibly compressed with my synthesized remarks. I would say, definitely what you're saying, Renée, about your work being a life project is very palpable in the sense of it being an organic, recombinant, and self-propagating sort of entity, which does remind me of breath and sort of something that is alive. At the same time, I think, especially at Dia Beacon, with many of the works dealing with ideas of colonial expansion, but also ideas of modernist or institutional utopias, it makes me think of breath and the idea of aspirations, both individual, institutional, collective, and otherwise. But also in terms of pacing, the idea of breath as a unit, and a way of measuring one's movement through space and time. At Dia Beacon, the works unfold over 2 corridors or are about the length of a New York City block. And oftentimes one is thinking about getting from point A to point B, but Renée's work has this incredibly effective way of slowing one down and making one aware of their movements, their steps, their breaths, these different units of movement that allow us to experience that space and her work anew. And maybe lastly, I'm thinking about breath in relationship to articulation. Actually, a speech coach once told me, one breath, one thought. And I find it interesting the way in which Renée's space poems, are these, choruses of these fragmented articulations, almost each of them sort of enunciating or uttering like a breath collectively. So with that,
there's so much that we could continue talking about, but
thank you all. I know we went a bit over. We started a bit late, but thank you.